Hi, my name is Vivian McAllister. I'm 33 years old, and this is my story. I never thought a simple backyard BBQ would be the moment that broke me. But sometimes, life doesn't unravel in thunderstorms or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's the smallest things, the most casual words spoken between grilled burgers and cold beer, that leave a scar so deep, it quietly bleeds for months. I grew up in Spokane, Washington. Not exactly the kind of place where you'd expect someone's life to fall apart over a piece of grilled chicken and a half-hearted joke, but that's where my story begins. I met Ethan McAllister at a volunteer cleanup for Riverfront Park. He was funny, gentle, and had this way of making people feel seen. That was rare. We fell in love fast, married within 2 years, and from the outside, everything looked perfect. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you're rooting for me to take back my power and turn this betrayal into something unforgettable. But behind the smiles, there was a weight I carried silently, a quiet, persistent loneliness. I always felt like I was standing just outside a warm house, watching a party through the window, never quite invited in. Ethan's family was close-knit, tight like a unit that had its own language, its own traditions, and I was the outsider they tolerated rather than embraced. Ethan's sister, Tessa, was the queen bee of that hive. She was sharp, witty, magnetic, and cold. I never quite knew where I stood with her. There was always an edge to her laughter when she spoke to me, like she was playing a game I didn't know the rules of. Over the years, I tried to win her over. I baked her favorite pies for her birthday, helped decorate for her baby shower, and even took care of her son when she had a work emergency. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. Then came the BBQ. It was late July, the kind of warm evening where the sun refuses to set until it's almost 9 p.m., and everything feels soaked in golden light. Ethan's parents had invited everyone over to celebrate his dad's retirement. There were lawn games, coolers of beer, and kids running barefoot in the grass. It was the kind of gathering that should have been joyful, and for a while, I almost believed it could be, until Tessa opened her mouth. I was standing near the grill, laughing lightly with Ethan and his cousin Jeremy about some dumb inside joke they had from college. I didn't even realize Tessa had come up behind us until I heard her voice, loud enough for the nearby group to hear. "You know," she said, flipping her long chestnut hair over her shoulder with that signature smirk, "if Vivian disappeared one day, I don't think anyone would even notice." The laughter that followed was sharp and awkward. Some people chuckled nervously, unsure of whether it was a joke or not. Ethan went silent. Jeremy looked down, and I froze. Time slowed. The meat on the grill sizzled. A breeze stirred the trees. Somewhere, a child screamed in delight. And I just stood there, blinking, heart thudding so loudly I couldn't hear anything else. It wasn't just the words. It was the casual cruelty in them, the dismissiveness, the fact that nobody stood up for me, not even Ethan, the man I had married, the man who claimed to love me. I excused myself, walked inside to the guest bathroom, and stared at myself in the mirror. My hands trembled as I pressed them against the cool porcelain of the sink. The reflection staring back at me looked hollow, not angry, not even sad, just erased. As if Tessa had spoken something into the world that had always been true, and now I could no longer pretend otherwise. I walked out 15 minutes later. No one had come to check on me, not a single soul. Ethan was laughing again, beer in hand. Tessa was showing pictures of her latest trip to New York on her phone. The world had moved on, and I felt like a ghost. That night, lying in bed next to a man who didn't even ask if I was okay, I made a decision. I wasn't going to disappear, but I was going to change. You see, that's the thing about being underestimated, ignored, and quietly dismissed. It builds something inside you, a quiet fire, a slow, smoldering heat. And once it catches, it doesn't go out. Over the next few weeks, I started seeing things differently. I watched more than I spoke. I paid attention to the cracks in Ethan's stories, the way his phone seemed glued to his hand lately. I listened to Tessa's offhanded comments at family gatherings, started connecting dots I'd ignored for too long. I wasn't paranoid. I was awake. I realized something important. The people who made me feel invisible had their own shadows. their own secrets. And if I was careful, if I was patient, I could turn the game around. I didn't want revenge, not at first. I just wanted to matter. But the more I dug, the more I discovered. And the more I discovered, the more I wanted them to feel exactly what they had made me feel that night at the BBQ. It didn't happen all at once. I didn't become some vengeful mastermind overnight. I was still Vivian, quiet, polite, the woman who brought wine to dinner parties and said thank you too often. But underneath, something darker was waking up, something stronger. And soon, the same family who had once laughed at me would learn that being invisible doesn't mean being powerless. But I'll get there. For now, this is just the beginning. That BBQ was the match, the spark that lit the fuse. And even though they didn't know it yet, every word spoken that night would lead them down a path they couldn't escape, a path I would carve. Because when you treat someone like they don't exist, sometimes they come back stronger than you ever imagined. And sometimes, they don't come back alone. The days following the BBQ felt like moving through molasses, slow, sticky, and impossible to escape. Ethan acted like nothing had happened. He kissed me goodbye in the mornings, asked if I wanted anything from the store, even brought home my favorite pastries from Indaba Coffee. But I wasn't fooled. Not anymore. I knew now that comfort could be a disguise, that indifference could wear a polite smile. I went through the motions, but inside, something was shifting. I started writing things down, not just my thoughts, but patterns, times, conversations. The way Ethan would step outside to take certain phone calls, the names that came up too often, the way his eyes flickered when I asked innocent questions. There's something about betrayal that sharpens your senses. I started listening between the words. Tessa, of course, continued to play the doting sister. She'd text me family updates as if her words at the BBQ had never happened. I didn't reply, not once. Silence became my new language, but I didn't stop watching. During a brunch at her place 2 weeks later, I pretended to be distracted while scrolling through photos on her refrigerator door. There, tucked behind a souvenir magnet from Seattle, was a photo of her and Ethan at a wine bar. Just the two of them, a candlelit table, his hand over hers. I stared at it for a moment too long, Tessa noticed. Her eyes met mine, and for the briefest second, I saw something flicker in her expression. Surprise? Guilt? Or maybe pride? As if she wanted me to see. I smiled, a small, knowing smile. Then I excused myself to the bathroom and took a moment to breathe. My chest was tight, but not with sadness. It was something else, something that tasted like clarity. I didn't confront Ethan. Not yet. There's a power in knowing more than the other person thinks you do. I began tracking him. Not obsessively, but strategically. He wasn't good at covering his tracks. Receipts in his jacket pocket. A second email address that popped up on our shared tablet. A perfume I didn't wear lingering faintly on the collar of his gym hoodie. I built a quiet collection of proof, like someone assembling a puzzle in the dark. Meanwhile, I played the role of the doting wife. I made dinner. I laughed at his jokes. I even let him think we were reconnecting. It was all part of the setup. I needed time, patience, precision, because what I was planning wasn't just about revenge. It was about erasure. I didn't want to hurt Ethan. I wanted to remove him from my life in a way that left him stunned and scrambling. I wanted to watch him realize what he'd lost long after it was too late. There's something you should know about me. I'm not dramatic. I don't scream. I don't throw things. I internalize. I plan. And once I lock onto something, I follow through. So I started saving money, quietly. I opened a separate bank account under my maiden name. I told Ethan it was for a project I was consulting on for a friend, which technically wasn't a lie. The project was me, my escape, my rebirth. I took on extra freelance work, started working longer hours. Ethan didn't question it. If anything, he seemed relieved to have more time away from me. He'd started coming home later, using the gym as an excuse. I pretended to believe him. At work, I started confiding in my colleague, Lena. Not everything, just enough to let her know something was wrong. She'd been through a messy divorce 2 years earlier and had become something of a quiet mentor to me. She never asked too many questions, just listened. Sometimes, that's all you need. A witness. One afternoon, as we sipped tea during a late lunch break, I asked her something that had been circling in my mind for weeks. Do you ever feel like the people who hurt you don't even realize what they've done? She looked at me for a long moment before answering. All the time, she said. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't be held accountable. I nodded. That night, I went home and started typing up a letter. Not to Ethan, not yet. To myself. It was a manifesto of sorts. A record of everything I'd endured. Every slight, every insult, every betrayal. I printed it out and folded it neatly, placing it in the back of my journal. I would read it again only when I needed to remember who I was before the hurt. The real shift came one evening in early September. I'd come home late from work and found Ethan already asleep, or pretending to be. His phone was unlocked on the nightstand. That never happened. I hesitated, then picked it up. The messages were right there. Him and Tessa. Not just flirtation, not just innuendo, but plans, meetings, memories. One message read, "You know she suspects something, she's not stupid." Tessa had replied, "Doesn't matter, she won't do anything, she never does." My hands went cold, my vision tunneled, but I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I took a screenshot, then another, then 20. I saved them all to a flash drive I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out book in my office. The evidence wasn't for a confrontation. It was insurance, a safety net, a guarantee. From that moment, everything accelerated. I contacted a lawyer, quietly, discreetly. I told her I wanted to prepare for a separation, but not file anything yet. We crafted a plan. I would gather financial documents. I would monitor assets. I would prepare to exit without warning. My lawyer, Monica, was sharp and unshakable. She never asked why. She only asked when. I liked that. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to drift further into his delusion. He started suggesting we take a trip together, some kind of romantic getaway. I agreed, enthusiastically. I told him I'd always wanted to see the Olympic Peninsula in the fall. He seemed pleased with himself, like he thought he was pulling me back in. I smiled. I played my part. But behind the curtain, I was tightening every screw. I updated my will. I moved sentimental items to a storage unit under Lena's name. I made copies of every legal document in our home. I even had our joint home appraised. Ethan didn't notice. He was too busy sneaking off to Tessa's apartment and deleting texts he thought I'd never see. But I'd already read them all. And more than anything else, it was her smugness that fueled me. The way she wrote about me as if I were some joke, some non-threat. "Poor Vivian," she once typed. "She's always been so plain." That was the moment I realized I didn't just want them to suffer. I wanted them to feel the full weight of what it means to underestimate someone who's had enough. One afternoon, as I walked past Riverfront Park, the place where Ethan and I first met, I sat on a bench and watched the carousel spin. Children laughed. The Spokane River glittered nearby. I closed my eyes and imagined a different version of my life. One where I'd married someone kind, loyal. One where I'd never had to pretend I didn't hear the insults. Where love wasn't a performance, but a partnership. Then I opened my eyes, and I smiled. Because I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that my plan was working. That every detail I'd put in place would soon matter. I wasn't just leaving, I was constructing a fall. A silent, sudden, irreversible collapse. And when it came, Ethan and Tessa wouldn't even see it coming, because people like them don't look back. They never think the shadows behind them could ever rise. But they do. And I was already standing. The weekend trip to the Olympic Peninsula was Ethan's idea, or at least he believed it was. I had suggested it a few weeks earlier, planting the seed while we were watching a travel documentary over takeout Thai food. He'd nodded distractedly, and I could almost see the thought take root in his mind. It didn't take long before he proposed it like it had come from him. That's how it always worked with Ethan. He preferred ideas when he thought they were his own. I agreed immediately, suppressing the flicker of satisfaction that ran through me. It wasn't about manipulation. It was about timing. This trip would be the turning point, the unraveling. We left Spokane on a crisp Friday morning. Early autumn had started to roll in, dusting the trees with gold and amber. I packed light but carefully. My journal, the flash drive, copies of legal documents tucked into a side pocket of my bag. Ethan didn't notice. He was too busy complaining about traffic and flipping through radio stations. He made jokes during the drive, tried to hold my hand once or twice. I let him believe. He even booked a small cabin near Lake Crescent, complete with a fireplace and a view of the water. Romantic, he said. A reset, he called it, as if our marriage was a machine that just needed a restart button. The cabin was charming, I'll admit that. Pinewood walls, a cozy loft bed, a porch overlooking the lake. But beneath the rustic beauty was something else. Space, isolation, a controlled environment, the perfect stage for truth to take center spotlight. That first evening, we had wine on the porch. Ethan tried to reminisce about our early days. Remember when we got lost trying to find that pumpkin patch outside Cheney? He laughed, swirling his glass. You got so mad at me for not using the GPS. I smiled and nodded, but my mind wasn't on pumpkins. It was on Tessa, on her hands where mine used to rest, on their whispered texts, on the messages I had printed and folded into the pages of my journal. Later that night, when Ethan was in the shower, I stood by the fireplace holding the journal in my hands. I opened it, stared at the screenshots of their betrayal. Their arrogance bled through the ink. Words like, "she'll never leave," and "she's too dependent." I could still hear Tessa's voice from that BBQ, echoing like a taunt in the back of my mind. No one would notice if you disappeared. They were wrong. Someone would notice. I would make sure of it. On the second day, I asked Ethan to go hiking with me. There was a trail near the lake, long, winding, and quiet. He grumbled a bit, said he'd rather relax, but I insisted. "It'll be good for us," I said, lacing up my boots. He gave in. He always gave in when I pushed gently. The trail was stunning, leaves crunching underfoot, sunlight slipping through the canopy in soft beams. We walked in silence for a while, our footsteps the only sound. Then, halfway through a clearing, I stopped. Ethan turned, confused. "What's up?" he asked, brushing a leaf from his jacket. I took a breath. "I know about you and Tessa." It was not dramatic. I didn't shout. I didn't throw accusations like daggers. I simply said it, clear and calm, like stating the temperature. Ethan froze. His eyes widened for a moment, then narrowed. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Vivian," he began, reaching for some excuse. Some lie. "I've seen the messages, the photos. I know it's been going on for a while." His face paled. "Listen, it's not what you think. I held up a hand. "Please. Don't insult me further." He looked like a man unraveling, his carefully built reality starting to fracture. "It was a mistake. She came on to me. I didn't mean for it to happen." I raised an eyebrow. "You didn't mean for it to happen for 6 months?" He stammered. "It didn't mean anything. You're the one I love." I almost laughed. The audacity. "You let your sister speak to me like I was nothing. You let her humiliate me. And you think you can just say, 'I love you,' and that's enough?" He took a step closer. "Vivian, I panicked. It got out of control. But we can fix this. We can—" "No," I said, my voice steady. "You can't fix this." He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Maybe he was. Maybe he was seeing the version of me I'd hidden all these years, the one that wouldn't be stepped over or silenced. I turned and began walking again, faster this time. The trail looped back to the cabin, and I needed to get there before him. I needed time to finish what I'd started. Ethan trailed behind me, muttering to himself. Apologies, justifications. None of it mattered. I had already made my decision. Back at the cabin, I packed my bag swiftly. I left the journal on the table, opened to the page with their messages. I placed his wedding ring beside it. Then I took my car keys and left. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. He had already said everything through his silence, through his betrayals, through every moment he watched me fade and did nothing. I drove through the trees, past the lake, past the dreams I had once clung to. I didn't look back. By the time Ethan returned, I was gone. So was my name from our joint bank account. The locks on our home in Spokane had been changed. My lawyer had filed the necessary documents. The financial accounts were frozen. Every shared password was reset. Every trace of me had been methodically removed. All he had left was a house full of memories and a journal filled with truth. And then came the final blow. I printed copies of the messages and mailed them to key members of Ethan's family, his parents, his uncle, his grandmother, all people who adored him, who thought the McAllisters were a shining beacon of togetherness. Along with the screenshots, I included a short note. I thought you deserved to know the truth. I didn't sign it. Tessa called me once. Just once. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail, her voice high and strained. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said. "You're destroying everything." No, I wasn't destroying anything. I was revealing it. The aftermath was swift. Ethan's family imploded. His father disowned him. His mother stopped speaking to Tessa. Their image, their curated perfection, cracked wide open. And I walked away, not with vengeance in my heart, but with peace. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply letting the truth breathe, letting it speak for itself. In Spokane, I rented a small apartment downtown. I painted the walls myself, bought new dishes. I planted herbs on the windowsill. I built a life from scratch, not one built on silence but on strength. Lena visited often. She brought wine and soft blankets and reminded me that healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, gentle, intentional. One night, months later, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine and watched the city lights flicker. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't angry. I was free. Ethan had made me feel invisible, but I had never been more present, more grounded, more myself. And as the breeze rolled in from the river, I whispered to the night, "You were wrong, Tessa." They noticed. The first few weeks alone were strange. Not painful, not freeing either, just strange. There's a quiet disorientation that settles in when you're no longer pretending, when you no longer have to edit yourself to keep peace, to hold a crumbling marriage upright, or to dodge the sneering edge of a sister-in-law's words. My apartment in Spokane was modest but bright. It had high ceilings and creaky floors and windows that let in a soft gray light every morning. I didn't bring much with me, just clothes, a few books, my laptop, and an old wooden jewelry box my mother gave me before she passed. It was enough. The silence at first felt cavernous. There were no footsteps echoing down the hall, no rustling of bags or clinking of keys. Just me, my breath, the hum of the city outside. But slowly, the silence became something else. Space. Possibility. I stopped filling it with distractions and started listening to myself again. I got a job at a local design firm downtown, something small and steady. They needed someone who could manage creative projects and client expectations, and I needed somewhere to direct all the precision and control I had been using to hold my marriage together. It was a good fit. My boss, Rachel, was direct and kind, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was being seen for my ability rather than my availability. The office was near the river, and on lunch breaks I'd walk to a bench near the Monroe Street Bridge with a thermos of tea and just breathe. Not plan, not rehearse excuses, just exist. I didn't talk much about Ethan. I didn't need to. His shadow faded quicker than I expected. There were moments, of course, where something would catch me off guard, a song we used to play on road trips, or the smell of cedar wood like the cologne he wore. But those moments didn't crush me. They passed through me. I let them, and then I let them go. I started going to therapy. I didn't tell anyone at first, not because I was ashamed, but because it felt like something sacred. A quiet room once a week where I could speak the truth out loud without being interrupted or minimized. My therapist's name was Naomi. She wore oversized sweaters and had a laugh that sounded like it belonged to someone much younger. The first thing she told me was, "You don't need to justify pain to treat it." That sentence stayed with me. I had spent so long believing that I had to prove my hurt, that if there weren't bruises or screaming fights, it wasn't real. But Naomi helped me see the scars I carried were valid, that words can wound deeper than fists, that neglect is its own form of violence. Little by little, I reclaimed the parts of myself I'd shelved to keep Ethan happy. I started painting again, just watercolors, nothing grand, but it reminded me of who I was before I was someone's wife. I joined a local book club at Auntie's bookstore. The women there were warm and unapologetically smart. We talked about fiction, but also about grief, resilience, and starting over. One of them, a woman named Becca, had been through a similar betrayal. We bonded instantly, like survivors of the same shipwreck who recognized the salt still on each other's skin. She'd bring homemade muffins to our meetings, and I started looking forward to her laugh more than the books. There was no dramatic transformation. I didn't dye my hair or run off to Europe. I didn't post cryptic quotes on social media or try to prove anything to anyone. My growth wasn't performative. It was personal. I built it slowly, like a house with no blueprint, just brick by careful brick. I forgave myself for not seeing the signs sooner. I stopped replaying the BBQ in my mind like a broken record. I stopped wondering if I had been enough. I realized that wasn't the right question. The question was, had he ever truly deserved me? Around mid-November, the first snow fell. Spokane looked like something out of a postcard. I stood on my balcony with a cup of hot coffee, wrapped in a thick blanket, and watched the flakes drift down. That night, I lit a single candle in my apartment and sat quietly. No music, no distractions, just gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the strength I never knew I had until it was tested. Tessa sent me an email a few days later, a long one. No subject line, no greeting, just paragraphs of what felt like a mix of rage, regret, and confusion. She accused me of destroying her relationship with her parents. She claimed Ethan had spiraled into depression. She said I'd always been calculating beneath the sweetness. I read it once, then again, then I deleted it. She wasn't wrong, not entirely. I had been calculating, but only because I had been pushed into silence for too long. And her suffering? That wasn't mine to carry. She had made her choices. So had Ethan. I simply decided not to be the collateral damage anymore. That choice wasn't cruel. It was survival. Becca and I started meeting outside the book club, just the two of us. We'd grab coffee at Boots Bakery or walk through Monito Park wrapped in coats and conversation. One evening in December, as we sipped mulled wine on my couch, she turned to me and said, "You seem lighter." I smiled. I think I am. By New Year's Eve, I felt like I'd built a foundation strong enough to hold new things. I wrote a list of intentions, not resolutions. I didn't want to change who I was. I wanted to return to her, the woman who trusted her gut, the woman who loved without apology but also had boundaries like iron rails, the woman who, when pushed to the edge, didn't fall. She flew. I framed that list and placed it near my front door. A reminder. Every time I left home, I passed it. And every time I returned, I did so knowing that no one could take this piece from me again. I ran into Ethan once, mid-January, at the grocery store of all places. He looked thinner, tired. He saw me in the produce aisle and froze, a bag of lemons in his hand. I met his gaze, offered a polite nod, and turned away. That was it. No words, no second glances. Just closure that didn't need to be spoken. Naomi said later that sometimes the most powerful statement is silence. She was right. I didn't owe him anything, not even a confrontation. I had already taken everything I needed the moment I chose myself. That spring, I applied to an art exhibit downtown. Small local gallery, mostly unknown artists. I submitted 3 of my watercolors. 2 were rejected. 1 was accepted. The one I painted on the night I read Tessa's message. I had named it Echo. It was abstract. Stormy blues, fractured reds, a single gold line breaking through the center. When I stood before it on opening night, surrounded by strangers, I felt something rise in my chest. Not pride, not revenge, something better, peace, wholeness. The quiet realization that I had turned pain into color, betrayal into brushstrokes, and silence into a story worth telling. I didn't just survive, I rebuilt. And the woman standing in that gallery? She was unshakable. Spring in Spokane carries a strange duality. There's the hope of new beginnings, the cherry blossoms, the longer days, the laughter of kids running through Riverfront Park. But there's also something ghostly in the thaw, the way snow melts slowly, revealing the wreckage hidden beneath. I felt that duality within myself. I had built something strong out of the ruins, but there were still corners I hadn't swept, still echoes of voices I hadn't silenced. And then, one morning in late April, A letter arrived at my door. Not an email, not a text. A real physical envelope. No return address. Just my name, handwritten in familiar loops. I knew it was from her before I opened it. Tessa. Her handwriting was unmistakable, overconfident, graceful, and laced with passive aggression, like everything else about her. I sat on my kitchen stool, coffee in hand, and unfolded the paper. 3 pages, front and back. It wasn't an apology. Of course not. Tessa didn't apologize. It was a confession, a weapon, a warning. It started with how her life had unraveled. Her career had taken a hit after whispers began circulating in her firm. The kind of whispers that don't accuse, but suggest. Her parents had gone quiet, withholding invitations, declining to babysit her son. Ethan had pulled away from her entirely. According to her letter, he was no longer responding to her calls. Apparently, he blamed her for everything. Said she ruined his life. That was the part that made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was inevitable. I had handed him nothing but truth. He had destroyed his own life the day he chose deception over decency. And now that it was crumbling, he needed someone to blame. Tessa was the obvious scapegoat. She ended the letter with a single line that didn't surprise me, but still made my fingers tighten around the page. I hope you're happy now. I folded the paper slowly, tucked it into a drawer without a word. I didn't need to respond. My life was my response. But that letter sparked something in me, an idea I hadn't considered before. I had walked away with grace, with dignity, but part of me still carried the weight of what they had taken from me. Not just time or love or family, but reputation, story. While I was quietly rebuilding, they had likely told their version to whoever would listen, made themselves victims of my strength, painted me as cold, calculating, unforgiving, and it gnawed at me, not because I needed their approval, but because I knew the truth mattered, even if only to me. So I decided to tell it. I pitched an anonymous essay to a regional women's magazine, a personal piece about betrayal, family, and what it means to reclaim your voice after being silenced for too long. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. The power was in the details, the ache behind the lines, the recognition readers would feel in the quiet parts, the subtle humiliations that no one talks about but everyone knows. I wrote it in one sitting. I didn't stop to cry or question myself. I just wrote. And when I was done, I sent it off without looking back. 2 weeks later, they published it. The article spread quickly, not viral, but visible. It was shared in community groups, quoted on book club pages, printed and pinned to break room walls. People started messaging the magazine asking if the author would write more. Some guessed at my identity. Others didn't care. What mattered was the resonance. The collective breath readers seemed to take when they realized someone else had felt what they had felt. I wasn't alone. None of us were. I received an anonymous letter in the mail a week after the article came out. A simple note on yellow stationery that read, "You made me feel brave. Thank you." It hit me harder than I expected. I sat with it for a long time, fingers grazing the paper, and cried for the first time in months. Not from grief, from release. That single sentence validated what I had known deep down all along. My story was never just mine. It was shared, universal, a quiet rebellion against all the small ways women are made to feel invisible, disposable, unimportant. And then Ethan came back. Not in person, not at my door, but through a lawyer, his lawyer. I received a formal notice requesting a meeting to revisit the terms of our separation. I was confused at first. Everything had already been resolved months ago. But when I called my attorney, Monica, she explained. He wanted to challenge the division of assets. Apparently, he believed I had manipulated him into agreeing to terms he now found unfair and emotionally biased. I could almost hear his voice in those words, twisted by entitlement and bruised ego. He was losing control of the narrative. That's what this was. Not about money, about control. Monica was calm. "We'll respond. Don't worry. You've done everything right." And I had. Every document, every move, every protection. Still, it shook me. Not because I feared the outcome, but because I realized something else. Ethan wasn't done playing. And as long as he believed he had access to me, Even through courtrooms, he wouldn't stop. So I made a decision. I asked Monica to file for a restraining order, not because I felt physically unsafe, but because I needed a legal wall between me and his manipulations. It took time, testimonies, paperwork, but it was granted. When the order came through, I stood in my hallway staring at the stamped document in my hands, and a strange wave passed over me. Not victory, not vengeance, finality. The kind that settles into your bones and says, "This chapter is truly closed." That same week, I was invited to speak at a women's leadership event. The editor of the magazine had passed my name to the organizers, and they wanted me to share my story, not the article, but the person behind it. I hesitated. I wasn't used to speaking publicly. I wasn't sure I wanted my voice to fill a room. But then I thought about that yellow note, the one that said I made someone feel brave, and I said yes. The night of the event, I stood backstage listening to the murmur of the audience. My hands were cold. My heart was steady. When they called my name, I walked to the podium and looked out over the crowd. Faces, strangers, women of all ages, waiting. I cleared my throat, and then I spoke. "Hi, my name is Vivian McAllister, and I was once told in front of people I loved that no one would notice if I disappeared." Gasps. Stillness. I continued. I believed it for a while. I let it shape me, shrink me, silence me, but not anymore. I told them about the BBQ, about the betrayal, about the slow, intentional steps I took to reclaim my life. I told them about the fear, the quiet rage, the strength that bloomed from being underestimated. And when I finished, the room rose to its feet. Applause thundered. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I smiled. Because in that moment I wasn't invisible. I was undeniable. Later that evening, as I stood near the exit shaking hands, a young woman approached me. She had tears in her eyes. "My sister-in-law does the same thing to me," she said. "Every holiday, every birthday, and no one says anything." I took her hand gently. "You see it? That's the beginning. Now you decide what comes next." She nodded. We hugged. She whispered, "Thank you." As I walked home that night, Spokane felt different, brighter. Not because the streets had changed, but because I had. The city was no longer a backdrop to my pain. It was part of my healing, part of my power. The weeks that followed my speech moved in a rhythm I hadn't known in years. Not fast, not chaotic, just whole. The kind of rhythm you feel when you're not bracing for the next impact. I slept better, deeper, woke up before the alarm with a mind that didn't immediately reach for defense or dread. My mornings became a ritual. Coffee on the balcony, barefoot even when it was cold, the city yawning awake around me. I started keeping a notebook by the window, not for therapy, not for publication, just to write, fragments, memories, observations, one page at a time. There was no end goal, only reflection. My friends noticed it too. Becca said my laugh had changed. "It sounds like it belongs to you now," she said once over dinner, fork in hand, eyes warm. I didn't know how to respond. Maybe because it was the kind of compliment that goes beyond the surface. I was different. Not just on the outside, not just in how I dressed or how I walked, but in the bones. In the way I looked people in the eye without second-guessing my worth. Ethan never contacted me again. Not directly. The restraining order had done its job. His attorney eventually backed down from the asset revision when Monica sent over the documents. Everything in order. Every decision accounted for. There was no loophole to exploit. Nothing he could twist in his favor. I was no longer a loose end in his story. I was out. Completely. And I had made sure there was no back door. Tessa, however, resurfaced one last time. I was at the Saturday farmers market downtown, arms full of flowers and fresh bread, when I saw her standing near the honey vendor. She looked smaller than I remembered, her hair pulled back too tightly, face pale despite the spring sun. She saw me before I could turn. We locked eyes. For a second, I wondered if she would pretend not to know me, but she didn't. She approached, slow, cautious, like someone nearing a dog that once bit. "Vivian," she said, voice quiet. I said nothing. I just wanted to say. She hesitated, looked around as if the world might collapse around her. "I didn't think it would go this far." I blinked. That was all. She kept going, filling the silence like she always did. I didn't mean for you to get hurt. Ethan, he made promises, said things. I thought. She broke off, jaw clenching. You thought I'd stay quiet, I said. She flinched. You thought I'd play the role, smile through the betrayal, pretend like I didn't see what was happening right in front of me. Her voice came softer. I didn't think you'd burn it all down. I didn't burn it, I said. I just stopped carrying it. She looked at me like that sentence rearranged something in her brain. Maybe it did. I didn't stay long enough to find out. I walked away, sun on my shoulders, the scent of rosemary and lilacs in my arms. That night, I wrote in my notebook, power isn't about control, it's about release, knowing when to walk away and when not to turn back. By early summer, the gallery had invited me to submit more work. Not just one piece this time, a series. I called it Weightless. 7 paintings, each one representing a stage of my unraveling and my rebuilding. One was blue and gray, silence. One was crimson and black, recognition. One, all white with streaks of gold, reclaiming. The final piece was yellow, bold, with a single wide arc in the center, return. When they opened the exhibit, I stood in the back of the gallery and watched strangers react. Some leaned in, some wept, some took pictures. No one asked for explanations. That was the beauty of it. The meaning was theirs now too. And then came the email, from a publisher, small press out of Seattle. One of their editors had seen my essay and attended the leadership event. She wondered if I'd considered turning the story into something more, perhaps a memoir. I sat with the idea for weeks. Writing had always been my quiet place. The idea of making it public, of turning my pain into product, made me wary. But in the end, I didn't write it for money. I didn't write it for revenge. I wrote it so someone, somewhere, could open those pages and feel less alone. The book came out the following spring. I kept the title simple. No one would notice. It sold modestly, enough to start conversations, enough to travel further than I ever expected. I received letters from women in Kansas, in Dublin, in Johannesburg. Stories so achingly similar it was as if we'd lived the same life in parallel worlds. I replied to every single one, not because I had answers, but because I knew what it meant to be acknowledged. I moved once more, not far. A little cottage outside the city, near the Spokane River. It had a small garden and a sunroom and creaky wooden floors that reminded me of childhood. I grew tomatoes, painted the back porch myself, hung wind chimes in the corner, and learned to make sourdough that actually rose. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't epic, but it was mine. People often ask me if I ever loved Ethan, if I miss him, if I wish things had gone differently. I used to struggle with those questions, used to twist them around in my mind, trying to find the right shape. But now, I just answer honestly. Yes, I loved him. Or at least, I loved who I thought he was. I miss the idea of us, the dream I built alone. And no, I wouldn't change what happened, because what broke me also rebuilt me. Because had he stayed good, I never would have found great. There was a moment, about 2 years after the BBQ, where I caught myself humming in the kitchen. Nothing special, just a tune. A careless, happy little sound. And I realized I hadn't done that in years. I stopped, spoon midair, and smiled. That's the thing about healing. It sneaks up on you. It's not always loud. Sometimes, it's just a song in your throat or the way the morning light falls through your window and doesn't make you flinch. Sometimes it's knowing that your story no longer lives in the hands of those who hurt you. It lives in your own voice. And mine is louder than ever. I never imagined that the pieces of my life, shattered, jagged, left behind in a backyard where someone joked that my disappearance would go unnoticed, would become the foundation for something whole. But that's the thing about healing. It rarely looks like we expect. It doesn't come wrapped in grand finales or cinematic apologies. It comes slowly, quietly, like moss returning to stone, like breath returning after too many moments holding it in. I didn't set out to become a symbol or to write a book. I only wanted to feel real again, to be someone whose presence mattered, not because others said so, but because I decided it was true. 2 years after the book was published, I received an invitation to speak at a university in Oregon. They were hosting a symposium on voice and identity, and someone on the board had read, "No one would notice." I said yes, not because I loved stages or microphones, but because I remembered the woman I used to be, the one who sat on a bathroom floor during a family BBQ, heart beating through cracked ribs of silence, wondering if anyone would come looking. I wanted to speak to the one still sitting there. The auditorium was full that day. Students, faculty, community members. Some clutched copies of my book. Others just sat with open notebooks and curious eyes. When it was my turn, I stepped up, took a deep breath, and told them not the story of my pain, but the truth of my becoming. I spoke of silence and of standing up, of betrayal and boundaries, of the power in walking away, not as an escape, but as a declaration, I choose me. At the end, a young woman stood up and asked, "How do you know when you're healed?" I thought for a moment, then answered, "You don't. Not like a switch. Healing doesn't announce itself. One day you just wake up and realize the ache has faded. You speak your name out loud, and it sounds like home again. You stop rehearsing conversations with people who no longer deserve your energy. You start planting things, in the earth, in your life, that bloom." She nodded, wrote something down, and I knew then that my story had done what I had hoped. It had become a mirror, not a monument. Back in Spokane, life moved forward in quiet, beautiful ways. I started hosting writing workshops in my garden, a handful of women each time. We sat under string lights with mugs of tea and wrote about all the things we'd been told not to say. I watched their shoulders lower, their pens loosen, their laughter return. It became a sanctuary. No one needed permission to speak there. No one apologized for taking up space. I called the workshop the Garden of Loud Women. It felt right. Becca met someone, a teacher named Claire with a loud laugh and a softer heart. I watched them fall into rhythm with one another, and it reminded me that love doesn't have to be sharp or sacrificial to be real. Sometimes it's just ease. They brought me flowers from every trip they took, sunflowers from Idaho, wild roses from the coast. My kitchen windowsill became a calendar of joy, each petal a reminder of what it looks like to live unafraid. I stayed in touch with Monica, my attorney. What began as a professional necessity turned into something resembling friendship. We started meeting for lunch every few months, catching up over paninis and ginger lemon tea. She told me once, "You were one of the most prepared clients I've ever had, but also the one with the most sadness behind the strength." I didn't deny it, but I did smile. "That sadness taught me everything," I replied. "It was my compass out." And Ethan? Last I heard, he moved to Portland. Tried to start over with a new job in marketing. Tessa relocated to California with her son. No one from the McAllister family ever reached out again. I didn't expect them to. Their silence had always been their language, and I no longer spoke it. Sometimes I still walk past that park where Ethan and I first met. It doesn't sting anymore. The memories are there, yes, but softened by time and perspective. They don't own me. They're just chapters in a book I've already written, pages already turned. One spring afternoon, as I walked those familiar paths, I passed a young couple laughing on a bench. She leaned into him. He kissed her temple. And I smiled, not because I missed it, but because I remembered how far I'd come. In early autumn, a local radio station invited me to co-host a segment on personal narratives. Telling the Untold, they called it. We interviewed people from all walks of life, survivors, caretakers, dreamers, people who'd been pushed down and pulled themselves back up. Every voice mattered. Every story was a seed. After one particular episode, a caller left a message. "Thank you for reminding me that my voice is still mine, even after everything." I played it twice, then wrote it on a Post-it and stuck it above my writing desk. I adopted a dog, a shaggy rescue named Juniper with crooked ears and eyes that held old stories. She followed me everywhere, through the garden, through the bookstore aisles, even into the kitchen where she'd sit patiently while I tried new recipes. She didn't need much, just presence, companionship. She reminded me how simple love could be when it wasn't tangled in expectation. The seasons turned. I turned with them. And slowly, a different kind of future began to take shape. Not one based on survival, but on creation. I started writing fiction again. Stories about women who weren't broken, just bruised. About sisters who healed. About endings that weren't tragic, but transformative. Publishers noticed. A new contract came through. A new book. A new voice. But the same truth at its core. You are not invisible. Not anymore. Never again. One night, as summer gave way to fall, I stood on my back porch, watching the wind carry the leaves in wild spirals. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who smiled through the insult, who stayed quiet to keep the peace, who looked at love like something she had to earn. I whispered to her across time, "We made it. You're safe now." The air carried it away, but I knew she heard. I often say that revenge wasn't the ending. I chose peace instead, but that's not the full truth. The revenge was never about ruin. It was about rising, about building a life so full, so honest, that the people who once tried to shrink you can't recognize the version of you that stands tall today. That is the truest revenge. Not bitterness, not collapse, but wholeness. And if you're reading this, wondering if anyone would notice if you disappeared, I want you to hear me clearly. I would, because I know what it feels like to vanish in plain sight, and I also know what it means to return. Bolder, brighter, unapologetically whole. My name is Vivian McAllister. I was erased once. Now I write in ink too loud to ignore. And this time, I'm not walking away. I'm standing. Have you ever been made to feel invisible by the people closest to you? Share your story in the comments below. If this journey spoke to you, please like and subscribe to hear more stories of courage, healing, and reclaiming self-worth. Share this with someone who might need a reminder that walking away isn't weakness. It's strength. Thank you for being here, and remember, your voice matters, your presence matters, and you never have to disappear to be seen.